Hey guys, welcome to FinkTem Languages. Today I just wanted to make a quick video about something that I've been learning in school recently, and that is the difference between intensive reading and extensive reading when you're learning a foreign language. And a lot of you know that I am currently a student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee studying linguistics, applied linguistics. And I'm also studying the subtle art of teaching English as a foreign language. So in one of my classes, one of the books that we've had to read is this textbook, Teaching Readers of English. And it's specifically about teaching people how to read English, but the principles in here are solid and they apply to whatever language you want to teach or whatever language you're learning. There's a lot of really strong linguists quoted in here, second language acquisition experts, and there's a lot of interesting material in here. So I just want to read you a quote out of here really quick, having to do with different types of reading. And I said at first that we're going to talk about intensive reading and extensive reading and their differences, and how you can use those two. And so, well, what are intensive and extensive reading? Well, that's what it's going to talk about here in this book. An early definition of intensive reading states that its purpose is to take a text, study it line by line, referring at every moment to our dictionary and our grammar, comparing, analyzing, translating, and retaining every expression that it contains. Nonetheless, most classroom instructors would define intensive reading more broadly by saying each text is read carefully and thoroughly for maximum comprehension. So in intensive reading, it really is just what it sounds like. You're reading intensively. You're studying the text. And this is called, I believe this is also called a bottom-up technique, because you're starting at the bottom, you're looking at words, prefixes, suffixes, noun cases, you're looking at verb conjugations, you're looking all the way at the specific letters, and you're just studying that word by word, line by line, and then you work your way up. So you start by understanding the words, then you understand the sentence, the paragraph, and then you grasp the whole meaning of the whole passage of whatever you're reading. And it's a very thorough technique. That's why it's called intensive. And then you contrast that with extensive reading. Let me find the quote in here about extensive reading. All right, it says, the teaching of reading, they defined extensive reading in very basic terms. The teaching of reading through reading. There is no overt focus on teaching reading. Rather, it is assumed that the best way for students to learn to read is by reading a great deal of comprehensible material. These definitions focus on quantity of materials read in contrast to the explicit classroom teaching of reading. So when you're doing extensive reading, it also is just what it sounds like. You're just reading a lot, and you're reading a lot of materials, and the important thing is that it's enjoyable. You're reading things that you want to read, and it's fun. They can engage you and keep you reading a lot. And probably one of the most well-known linguists in the field of second language acquisition is Stephen Krashen, and he highly recommends extensive reading. He calls it free voluntary reading, and he's published a lot of articles, and I think he's published a book on this called Free Voluntary Reading. And he says that free voluntary reading or extensive reading may be the single most effective thing that you can do to learn a foreign language. But the important thing that I want to emphasize in this video is that they are both valid ways of learning languages. Intensive reading and extensive reading, they both have their place. And I've used both of them very effectively. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about these two different methods and how they compare and contrast. Extensive reading is obviously a lot more fun because you're just reading for fun. You're just reading a lot. If you enjoy reading to begin with, then you're golden. All you have to do is start doing that in your foreign language. And that's something that I've done. I've read Game of Thrones in Spanish just because I like Game of Thrones. And you can tell that's a pretty lengthy, that's a hefty book. I've also read, this is Dan Brown's Inferno. And I promise it's in Spanish. I know it's the same, it has the same title in English and in Spanish. There, see, una novela. And I've read both of these books in Spanish just because I like reading. And the key is finding books that are interesting to you. If you're not interested in fantasy or thriller novels, then find something that's right for you. Find a romance novel, find a mystery, find sci-fi, whatever it is, find self-help books. You know? Here I have 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I don't think I've read this whole thing, but I read a good portion of this in Spanish because that's also interesting to me. And you have to find one of the things in my textbook that was emphasized is that for extensive reading, it has to be comprehensible material. You need comprehensible input, otherwise you're not gonna get anything out of it. If you are a B2 in Spanish and you start reading Game of Thrones, you're gonna get nothing out of it. You're not gonna understand a word, and you're just wasting your time. I have a high level in Spanish, so I can read books like Game of Thrones or 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. My level in French is not as high as it is in Spanish. So when I do extensive reading, and this is the last book that I read, or one of the last books I read extensively in French, Compte les Étoiles. In English, it's Number the Stars, and it's a children's book. But I highly recommend this book because even though it's designed for children, even for adults, it's just very endearing. I highly recommend this book. It's about the Holocaust, about some of the Jews that were persecuted in Denmark, and then the Danish people that resisted the Nazis. It's just a great story. I recommend it. And this was translated into French, but doesn't matter. It's still in French, and it still gave me a lot of extensive practice of extensive reading, and I enjoyed it a lot. So I highly recommend this book. And one of the things I want to point out, here's another book, Le Petit Prince. This is originally in French, but it's been translated into a lot of languages, like pretty much every language you can think of. And it's also a children's book, but it's very interesting for an adult. And it's just, I don't know how to explain it. It's a great read. It's very deep for a children's book. But I didn't do extensive reading on this one. Not initially, at least. And I've actually done a whole video on this earlier, a few months ago, called, I don't remember, it was like 4 steps to learning languages with books. And I talked about this book specifically in my method, where I go through the book and I will literally just highlight words that I don't know. This is more of an intensive reading exercise. It was still relatively extensive, but because I was highlighting words that I don't know and focusing on the actual bottom level elements, like the words and phrases and suffixes and prefixes and stuff, and then I would make myself a little dictionary and focus on memorizing vocabulary. That's more intensive. That's actually studying. You're not just reading just for fun at that time. But it becomes more extensive as you go through it more and more, because the first time I read through this book, I highlighted all the words I don't know in pink. And then the next time I read through it, I started highlighting the words that I don't know in yellow. So you can actually go through this book and see which words I highlighted my first time through. You know, so pink, I highlighted that my first time through. Yellow, I highlighted that my second time reading. Green, that was my third time going through. After a while, you start to just become more familiar with the words that originally were throwing you off. And you don't have to spend as much time stopping and looking the words up. You just become familiar with them, and then you can just read through a little bit more fluently and more extensively for fun. So that's a great technique that starts you off learning intensively, and you progress more and more towards extensive reading. So So intensive reading and extensive reading play off of each other very well. And I like that. Because really what this is a type of spaced repetition. And I've talked about this before. Spaced repetition is one of the best ways for your brain to record memories and to store memories. And what it means is that if you learn a new vocabulary word and you just study it a bunch of times really quickly, one right after another, you're soon going to forget that word. But if you put space in between your repetitions, if you put space in between how many times you study that word, it makes your brain have to work harder to remember the word. And then it's doing a better job of forming those neural pathways, and your memories actually form more solidly and quicker and easier, and your memories will last longer. And that's one of the things that they try to create. They try to do that when you're using apps like Memrise. It's called spaced repetition apps because at the beginning they show you one vocabulary word a bunch of times, and then as you progress, they start to put more and more space in between your repetitions of those words. And it works pretty well. The problem with Memrise or, Anki or any of these online flashcard apps is that they show you these words out of context. So it doesn't mean a whole lot when you're just looking at a flashcard and just trying to remember that word out of context. And I'm not dissing Anki or Memrise because I think those apps are great. But a much better way of utilizing spaced repetition is by reading. Because if you're learning a foreign language, or anyone who has ever spent any time learning a foreign language knows this phenomenon that I'm about to describe. And it's where you learn a word, and even in your native language, if you've never learned another foreign language before, you've probably had this experience where you learn a new word that you've never heard, you've never seen, you have no idea what it means, but all of a sudden you learn this word. And then all of a sudden you just see it everywhere you look, right? You're the first day of your intensive reading, you learn this word that's highlighted, right? And you've never seen it before. All of a sudden, you start to see it on every page, and you're like, how in the world did I spend my whole life without knowing that word? And somehow I survived, but now all of a sudden I see that word every page of every page of the book that I'm reading, right? And it's like, you're just amazed how often this word is used. Well, that's spaced repetition. And not only is that spaced repetition, but that's spaced repetition in context. Because every time you run into that word, you now have a context of what's going on in the story that will help you place that vocabulary word or that memory somewhere in your mind, and it'll help you recall that better. So I don't know. I guess that's all I really have to say for this video. Intensive reading, extensive reading. Use them both. They're both great and they play off of each other really well. Extensive reading, where you're just reading a lot for fun, and that's great. And that's probably one of the best ways of learning. But also intensive learning, where you're actually studying the text that you learn, and you're worried more about understanding everything that's going on and understanding every piece of grammar and every vocabulary word. And that's necessary too. It's necessary to help you perfect the grammar, whereas extensive reading, where you're not necessarily worried about the grammar very much, that's going to give you a lot of repetitions, it's going to give you a lot of practice, and it's going to help build your fluency. So I hope this video has helped you kind of think about how you can use reading in your foreign language. If you liked the video, then feel free to subscribe with the subscribe button down below. I make new videos every Monday and every Friday. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching my video. We'll see you guys in the next one.